Your grandmother had dark hair. Your great-grandmother had darker skin than her neighbors, and an explanation that was always the same: Black Dutch. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wanted to. But Black Dutch was never a people. It had no homeland, no founding migration, no language. And when the DNA results started coming back, for thousands of families who had carried this story across generations, they didn't confirm the legend. They revealed something underneath it that American history had spent 2 centuries trying not to see. That word comes from somewhere specific. The Dictionary of American Regional English describes Black Dutch as a dark-complexioned people of uncertain origin. That word, uncertain, was not an accident. It was always the point. The phrase appears in American records as far back as the colonial era, but it never referred to one group. In the 18th century Pennsylvania, German-speaking immigrants were widely called Dutch, a mangled anglicization of Deutsche, the German word for German. The Pennsylvania Dutch were never Dutch. They were German, and some of them were noticeably darker than the Anglo-American settlers around them. Dark enough that people asked. Dark enough that an explanation felt necessary. Moved to New York, and the term means something slightly different. Dutch settlers who arrived in New Amsterdam with swarthier complexions than their neighbors were called Black Dutch. The historical cause is documented. Spanish forces occupied the Netherlands for much of the 16th and 17th centuries. Children born to Spanish soldiers and Dutch women carried that Iberian ancestry forward across generations and then across the Atlantic. They looked different. They needed a name for what they were. 2 groups, 2 different causes, the same 2 words. And then the term starts moving south. The Appalachian backcountry, Western Virginia, the Carolinas, Eastern Tennessee, Kentucky, was the edge of the colonial world in the 18th century. Paper trails went thin there. Legal categories enforced on the coast arrived late, if they arrived at all. A family could move into a mountain valley, give a new account of themselves, and begin again. And when someone asked about the dark hair, the olive skin, the features that didn't fit the Anglo-Saxon template, the name many of these families chose was Black Dutch. So before a single DNA test was ever run, the label was already a cover story. The question that takes a century and a half to answer is, what was it covering? Here is the problem at the center of this. The same 2 words were used by German immigrants in Pennsylvania, by Dutch settlers in New York, and by Appalachian families who had no meaningful connection to either place. The label doesn't point to a population. It points to a function, and that function was concealment. Genealogist James Pylant, who studied Black Dutch claims across American family records, concluded plainly that a single definition cannot cover every family that uses this term. By the early 19th century, the phrase had become a refuge. If your ancestry was mixed, if your skin was dark, if the truth of where you came from carried legal or social danger, Black Dutch was available. No documentation required, no explanation necessary. It simply redirected the question somewhere easier. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what racial classification meant in this country at that moment. In the antebellum South, to be identified as African American meant enslavement, or if you were already free, a legally enforced narrowing of nearly every right you had. After the Indian Removal Act of 1830, to be identified as Native American meant dispossession. Families of mixed ancestry, and there were far more of them than official history ever acknowledged, needed to be documented as something else. Black Dutch, Black Irish, Portuguese, Melungeon. These were not ethnic identities, they were shields. This was not deception born of shame, it was survival. But it means that every genealogical wall built around the phrase Black Dutch is not simply a gap in the records. It is often evidence that someone, at some point in that family's history, deliberately built that wall. Which raises the question no family legend ever answers directly. Who built it? And what were they protecting? To find out, you have to go back further than the Civil War, further than Indian removal, all the way back to colonial Virginia in the 1640s and 1650s, before the institution of chattel slavery had hardened into the structure that defined the next 2 centuries of American life. In the early colonial Chesapeake, before the Virginia slave codes of the 1660s closed the legal categories into rigid permanence, there existed a population of free people of color in an ambiguous legal position. They were not enslaved. Some owned land. Some entered legal contracts. Some intermarried with white indentured servants, European men and women who had crossed the Atlantic under labor contracts, occupying their own uncertain rung on the colonial social ladder. Genealogist Paul Heinig, whose landmark research traced free African Americans through colonial Virginia and North Carolina, documented this pattern in exhaustive detail. African men and European women forming families in the window before the law made those families impossible. Once the slave codes arrived, those families were pushed outward, south, west, into the mountains, into the places where legal enforcement was slowest and the land was hardest, and they carried their ancestry with them. The families historically called Melungeon, centered on Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, became one of the most studied populations associated with the Black Dutch tradition. For generations, Melungeon oral history claimed descent from Portuguese explorers, Turkish slaves, or Romani travelers, exotic origins that pointed emphatically away from Africa. DNA research published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy by researcher Roberta Estes and colleagues found something different. The ancestry of these families was primarily European and African. The patrilineal lines, which are direct male lineages traced through Y chromosome DNA, pointed largely to sub-Saharan African origin. The matrilineal lines pointed largely to Northern or Central Europe. In plain terms, the founding population of these families was black men and white women, meeting in colonial Virginia before the law separated them permanently. Their descendants, pushed into the mountains, intermarrying within their own communities across generations of legal exclusion, carried that origin forward, hidden beneath a name that pointed elsewhere. Estes noted, after the study was published, that there were a whole lot of people upset by the result. That reaction tells its own story. The Portuguese explorer, the Turkish ancestor, the mysterious Mediterranean thread, these were not just family stories. They were protective structures built across generations, maintained by necessity, and eventually inherited as identity. The DNA did not expose a lie. It exposed the depth of what the lie had been protecting. But that answer creates a harder question. If the Southern Black Dutch tradition was largely a cover for African and European mixed ancestry, what was the Northern tradition covering? And were they ever actually the same thing? Not really. They shared a label. The mechanisms underneath were different. In Pennsylvania and New York, Black Dutch families showed primarily European ancestry in DNA studies, consistent with what the history actually suggests. Their darker features came from documented European mixture. The Iberian ancestry that entered the Dutch population through Spanish military occupation, and from a source most people overlook entirely. Sephardic Jewish refugees expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1497 resettled in the Netherlands in large numbers. Amsterdam became a major center of Sephardic Jewish life in the 17th century. Many of those families eventually crossed the Atlantic with the Dutch West India Company and settled in New Amsterdam and in the colonial South. Their ancestry, rooted in the ancient Near East, shaped by centuries of diaspora through Iberia, is genetically distinct from Northern European populations. Some of it entered mixed families over generations. It is part of why certain Dutch and German American families carried features that didn't match expectations, and part of why a label existed to explain them. So there were at minimum two distinct mechanisms feeding the same two words. A northern strand rooted in actual European and Mediterranean mixture, where the darkness was real and the German or Dutch ancestry was also real, and a southern strand where the label migrated with families fleeing racial classification, families whose actual ancestry was mixed European and African, and sometimes Native American, and whose claim to Dutch or German identity was primarily a legal survival strategy. The geography of Black Dutch claims maps almost perfectly onto the geography of racial pressure. The densest concentration runs from western Virginia and the Carolinas through eastern Tennessee and Kentucky, then spreads westward into Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, Texas, and Oklahoma. That is not a coincidence. It is the migration path of families under pressure. Every place the Black Dutch tradition intensified, you find stricter enforcement of racial classification, forced removal of native communities, or both. The label moved with the people who needed it most. Isolation deepened the pattern. The Melenguon communities intermarried within their own group across multiple generations, which preserved older genetic signals that might otherwise have been diluted. When the DNA research arrived, that isolation became evidence, a window into what the founding population had actually been. The mountains that hid these families also, accidentally, preserved the record of what they were hiding. Now state the myth plainly, because it deserves to be stated before it is broken. The myth is this: we are Black Dutch, we are European. The dark coloring in our family comes from across the ocean, from German ancestors in the Black Forest, or from Dutch settlers touched by Spanish blood, or from some Mediterranean thread so old nobody remembers its name. We are not African. We are not Native American. The color is a European thing. The DNA does not confirm this. For the majority of Southern families who carried this tradition, research indicates that African ancestry, the ancestry the label was specifically designed to hide, is present, in many cases prominently present. The Melungeon DNA studies, Heineg's genealogical work, and the results coming back to individual families through commercial testing all converge on the same point. In the American South, Black Dutch was not an ethnic identity. It was a racial shield deployed in a society that punished certain kinds of ancestry with legal violence. But the deeper reversal is not about any single family. It is about the categories themselves. The belief that race in America was a clean, biologically real, observable fact, that you could look at a person and know what they were, that the census categories mapped onto something true in the blood, was always a legal fiction. The categories were not discovered. They were created by specific laws at specific moments to serve specific economic and political purposes, and families were forced to choose their position within those categories, often under conditions of real danger. What the DNA tells us is not that these families were deceptive. It is that they were rational. They chose the safest available category. They passed it to their children as the truth about who they were. By the time those children's children ran a DNA test, the strategy had become a story. The story had become an identity. And the identity, when challenged by genetic evidence, revealed the architecture underneath it, which was not a genealogical puzzle. It was the genetic record of American racial law, written into the bodies of the people that law was designed to exclude. That is a harder truth than a mysterious origin, but it is a more honest one. The records lied. The census lied. The law lied. The bones did not. And what the bones show is not a mystery. It is not an exotic thread from some distant, suitably untraceable corner of the world. It is something far more specific and far more American than that. Free black men and white women forming families in colonial Virginia before the law closed around them. Sephardic Jews carried by diaspora across continents and oceans, arriving in New Amsterdam with ancestry that resisted easy classification. German immigrants explaining their dark features to a country that wanted everyone sorted and legible. Cherokee families watching the Trail of Tears approach, reaching for whatever label might keep them on their land. These are not the same story. They share a name. That name was borrowed, mispronounced, stripped of its original meaning, applied to new populations for new reasons, and passed forward until it meant everything and nothing at the same time. What modern DNA does not do is resolve this into a clean answer. It makes the question deeper. It shows that behind two words, Black Dutch, there are at minimum 4 or 5 distinct population histories, each rooted in a different crisis, each using the same cover for a different reason. The results don't tell you which one you are. They give you evidence. The historical work of figuring out what that evidence means still has to be done. And when that work is done, when the census records and the DNA results and the genealogical research are laid side by side, what emerges is a picture of the American colonial experience that is more mixed, more entangled, and more African than the official version of this country's history has ever been willing to say. Your grandmother had dark hair. You know that. What you may not have known, what the family story was specifically designed to prevent you from knowing, is that somewhere behind that hair, behind that skin, behind the explanation that was always the same and never quite right, someone made a choice. They chose safety over truth. And every generation that came after them inherited the safety without ever knowing the price that bought it.